Okay, so I would like to welcome all of you to our fourth session and fourth and last session of this semester's Semiosalong, which was dedicated to the semiotics of space. And we are very, very happy and excited to have both Alex and Joao with us today. As usual, we are recording this. If you don't want your face to show in the recording, you can tell us. We will have presentation and questions, and then presentation and questions. Those of you here, if you want to ask a question, you can come here and ask. Otherwise, you can just open your camera and microphone or whatever is more comfortable for you. I guess without further ado, I will now introduce you to our first speaker, who is Oleksii Popovich, and he is an MA student in Tartu. He has a background in sociology. He studied at Kyiv-Mohyla University. I'm sorry for my Ukrainian. Well, now he's doing a little bit of zoosemiotics, probably combining it with a bit of sociology, and he will talk to us about, well, his presentation is entitled "From Networks to Fluids, Shifting Spaces in Wartime Zoological Gardens," which is a very nice topic. So please, Alex.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Israel, for invitation. Okay, so now I shared the thing. It's working, right?
Yes.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Oleksii, or Alex, and basically what I'm trying to study interspecific relations in Ukrainian zoos during the wartime. And I will talk about today about the kind of the linkage of concepts that I think are useful to understand what is happening with human-animal relations in Ukrainian wartime zoos, and specifically regarding this space in the zoos. The lemur you can see here, his name is Bayraktar, and he was born in Kyiv Zoo in March. And Bayraktar is, of course, an interesting case of naming, because Bayraktar is a military drone. But also the interesting thing is that he was abandoned by his mother because of the shellings and the effects of bombings on his mother, Lemur. So the workers had to care for him on their own. And I'm going to start with some events or challenges that Ukrainian zoos faced, and in some cases, of course, continue to face in the war. And Ukrainian zoos were quite widely covered by mass media, especially in the first few months of the invasion. And generally, what was happening and what was affecting animals and processes in the zoo include shelling and explosions, direct damage of enclosures by rockets, but also acoustic effects of explosions nearby, and constant air sirens. Another thing is disruptions of electricity, water, and heating supplies that are needed to support the animals and stuff. And this is now again very relevant with tax on infrastructure. Also, the problems with food supplies, financial shortages because of absence of visitors, problems with transportation to and from the zoo, which was something that was especially relevant in the first weeks of the invasion, and shortages of staff needed to care for the animals. And it is quite important to say that different zoos in Ukraine were subjected to very different conditions. So, for example, while Feldman Eco Park in Kharkiv region suffers lots of destructions and killings of number of animals, as well as, unfortunately, several members of staff. Other zoos were less affected, and this caused a difference in decisions that were made. So Feldman Eco Park had to carry out a number of evacuations of animals, which is a very complicated process. While Kyiv Zoo became a host zoo for around 200 displaced animals. And it is important to mention that death and physical injuries of animals did not only occur because of direct effects of explosions. There were also reported deaths because of fear and of state of excitement in animals that was caused by sounds of nearby shelling that caused the animals to behave frenetically and injure themselves. And it is obvious but important to say that one of the basic tasks of the zoo is to safeguard animals from environmental threats and provide the best living conditions possible. And in case of the zoos, it involves creating a very complicated spaces that need constant maintenance and everyday attention and flow of supplies, as well as staff with specialized competencies. Without all of this, the zoo does not function. And all these challenges pose real threats to physical and mental health and had to be dealt with. And different creative strategies were invented to protect animals from war effects. For example, this is a screenshot from a short movie by Ukrainian project Babylon 13, which was filmed in the end of March 2022. And Kyiv Zoo director and some of the staff, they mentioned how they arranged the shelter from themselves in an unfinished aquarium space. And they lived in the zoo for several weeks because there were problems with transportation. This report also talks about an elephant, Horace, who had a 24-hour companion charged with soothing an elephant and feeding its apples. And the question for me was which concepts and frameworks to choose to explain how, despite all the devastating effects of the war, many zoos managed to keep the animals in best conditions possible. And I was also wanted to mention this in the responses, that this is a recent thing, that the plans of measures to provide animals during this infrastructure attacks, which include, as you see, insulation of buildings, electric generators, foodstuffs, and so on. And also this case of growing vegetables on gardens and greenhouses in cases of food supply disruptions. And returning to the zoosemiotics and active network theory, I think that both of these can be integrated very well, because the question is about the durability of material semiotic connections in the zoo that manage to hold and transform to safeguard the effects to safeguard animals from the effects of the war. And there should be kind of a working concept of agency of what is possible to do and who can do what. And I am using kind of both concept, the zoosemiotic, or basically semiotic concept of agency, and the concept of agency that is articulated back to network theory. And in zoosemiotics, it is known that agency is attributed to living beings. So living beings are capable of choice, and they interpret and act in their surroundings. And this would mean that the actors are animals and humans, so basically living beings. And zoosemiotics, this is part where I will talk about shortly, yes, provides a host of concepts that make agency secure and more complete, and the notions of full weight, which everyone knows about, and echo fields, which probably many know about, are instrumental in this regard. And yes, I will not probably talk too much, but animal has a subjective world rooted in bodily capacities, and the world consists of functional perception action cycles. And animal perceives elements of environment as significant in some respects and acts upon them in some manner. So the Umwelt notion basically creates the idea of a subjective space of an animal, of what is possible to perceive and react to. And the eco field hypothesis, it specifies the notion of Umwelt that includes special arrangements that are needed for satisfaction of specific needs of an animal. For example, nesting, foraging, resting, guarding, and so on. And then in principle in zoos, most of these have to be fulfilled. And even in the case of wartime conditions. And this concept specifies environmental conditions that enable carrying on of such functions. And while the notion of Umwelt enables to ask the question which means something, for example, electricity turning off for the sound of explosion, has on the animal based on the observation of animals' behavior, the notion of ecofield allows to ask a different question: what is the sufficient arrangement of objects that enables an animal to conduct a particular activity and satisfy its needs? So, for example, which actions of objects are needed in order to, for example, calm down an animal and ensure that it is minimally disturbed by worst conditions? So, the important thing in this sense is that, and this was already reported, for example, in the studies of World War II zoos, that just as humans, animals do not react in the same way. So within the same species, animal of the same species, they can react in very different manners to the same meaning carrier based on the learning and experience and psychology makeup and so forth. So Timo Maran in 2020 integrated these three notions into a method called ecological repertoire analysis, which allows to trace the action of an animal in ecofield, the action belongs to, and not just material object that afford this activity. And within this notion, the role of material object is it has a different meaning based on the animal species, Umwelt, physical, mental condition, and other contextual aspects. And these are kind of the concepts that start from the subject and animal subject specifically. So they, roughly speaking, able to look at transformations in the world and from the animal points of view, and they create a sort of ability to analyze the subjective space. However, it is not sufficient to account for interspecific relations and human-animal relations, which are key for survival of animals in the zoo. Because it is quite obvious that animals in the zoo do not exist in isolation, and many are constantly interacting with conspecifics, living in the same enclosures, with animals living in nearby enclosures, and of course with different kinds of humans, visitors, and workers of the zoo. Yes, this is a quote from a document published on Kyiv's website in March 2022, which is called Recommendations from Kyiv's Specialists for Animals Protection and Stress Due to Shooting and Bombing. And there they insist on communicating with, it's directed towards pets, so towards pet owners. So they insist on communicating with birds, maintaining tactile contact, and so on. So when we think about transformations, at least in case of some animals, this had to be transformations which involved more of the human presence and more of direct contact, more of communication within the enclosure for the animal. And yes, of course, the role of the keepers is very important because a number of animals develop an attachment to a particular keeper, to a specific person. So even a replacement of a keeper to a different person can stress out an animal. And as we remember, there were keeper shortages all through and through. However, this can also be the case that the absence of interaction with visitors can negatively affect an animal. And in Babylon 13 movie, one of the keepers mentioned how Kyiv Zoo gorilla is feeling sad and bored without interaction with the visitors. There is a very interesting transactional model of communication that was developed by Cerrone and ekivi in their article. This is the model that allows to account for species-specific communication. Channels allows to account for changes in environment through the course of social communication and account for individual traits of an animal. And now these are the zoosemiotic concepts that allow to identify what things mean for a particular animal, what are necessary special conditions for an animal to satisfy its needs, and describe in detail how communication that fosters human-animal social bond and aims to protect it from more effects happen. And my point is that it is, if we are to account for the durability of the network of relations that allow the animals to stay safe and cared for, this is insufficient. Because while communication processes are very helpful, things are not maintained just by communication, but furthermore, it is also insufficient to describe things that mattered to animals, so were present and reacted by animals within within the Umwelt or ecofield concept to understand what was happening, so to say, behind the scenes to maintain interspecific relations in place. So for a human-animal relation to stay in place, things should happen outside the perception of an animal and perhaps outside the perception of a particular human that's maintaining the bond with an animal. For example, consider this is an electricity generator. And for an animal, there is no difference whether electricity is generated by a generator or it is generated by regular power supplies. However, there's quite a lot of things done in order for the generator to work, for the electricity source to be replaced, which is a condition for the welfare of an animal. Electricity is behind the scene of enclosure of Umwelt and ecofield. So to understand how a particular relation is maintained, it is important to go beyond the Umwelt and beyond communicative interactions observation. And I believe that what is important to trace is a life support network, which is something that a concept that I made up. So if anyone wants to criticize, please do it. But it is, I define it that way, that a life support network of a particular animal could be said to consist of repeated actions involving partially replaceable actors that may or may not be perceivable in the Umwelt of an animal. And actors in the life support network make a difference as long as they influence the animal's well-being. Now the question here, of course, everything influences the animal well-being, but the point is that whether if we remove something, it makes a significant impact. And for example, I can explain it. I am here located and I'm talking, and what is essential for me to talk, there is a table behind me. If it is removed, nothing happens. If a chair is removed that I'm sitting on, the talk will be interrupted. So this is kind of the same thing, that what is important is not necessarily kind of perceived and acted upon, but it is also, if it is removed, it makes an impact. And the actors could be very different, from zoo director to electricity generator. And now this is where I'm going directly now to spaces. And I believe that the concept, the spatial concept of active network theory are quite important. And I consider most useful several concepts that were developed by John Law and Anne-Marie Moll. And first, active network theory proposes to understand space not as a map of geographical location of stuff, so regional space as Law called it, and the regional space is defined by a set of objectively measured coordinates. So my room is space that is geometrically defined. However, instead, Law and Latour developed the concept of a network space, and the network space is a space created by significant relations of things. So things that are closely related, intertwined, or interweave form a network space. And in a network space, something can be very close geographically to something else, but it can be absolutely insignificant. However, something located very far away can be of a great significance. Again, this is the example of this, action that I'm doing right now. So, and the key difference from Umwelt to ecofield is that network space is not the subjective space of a particular species conditioned by perception. So this way, network space allows to move to a kind of a transsubjective analytical standpoint. It means that in order to understand how spaces are maintained, it is important to get to which kind of decisions and which kind of actors were made to ensure that things were going on. And it means to account for background actions and object enrollments that remain behind the scenes. Another example, that the director of the Kyiv says that during the first day of the invasion, 30 people came on the zoo instead of 300 workers who actually worked there. And he had to clean the enclosures on his own. So various capacities were redistributed, something was prioritized, something was deprioritized. and so forth. Now, to what is on the slide, there are other two concepts, fluid space and fluid technology. And fluid technology is something that he exemplifies by a Zimbabwean bush pump, which is a water pump with changeable boundaries, which lacks essential elements. So it is a very adaptable pump that can be kind of like a model technology, but model technologies that are where the models are not predefined by the inventor. So, and this is a quote that if the boundaries of the pump are fluid, then what makes it work also turns out pretty fluid. In terms of the mechanics, bolts essential because they hold the pump to its mounting, or the handle to the pump, they turn out not to be needed. There are pumps that work well in their absence. Leather seals are replaced with bits of old tire, which may work just fine. Perhaps there is a core to the pump, some parts that are essential, but if so, then what the core is constantly being undermined, its limits are uncertain, and the essential mechanics turn out not to be essential. And what he says also about fluid objects is that in case of fluid objects, new relations can be added and subtracted bit by bit in order to retain continuity, but you cannot replace everything once. And also that no particular border around the object is privileged, so almost everything can be changed, but not everything at once. And fluidity, as a thing, it becomes visible when the network fails. So just exactly the situations with the zoos, when in these extreme conditions which disrupt the regular course of behavior. And fluid technologies can exist in what Lowe and Moll called fluid spaces in the style of anemia. The point of that study was that anemia was a different thing in Africa and in the Netherlands. So it's not the point about it is a social construction, whatever, but it's the thing that in practice, different means were used to make a diagnosis, and different things, different stuff was necessary. So what mattered was the availability and necessity of lab measurements, a severity of patients, possibility to mix up symptoms with other diseases, and so forth. So different things constituted the diagnosis, anemia dependent on the circumstances and context. And different skills of doctors were more necessary in one place than in the other. For example, as they report in African countries, even if the laboratory was present, the measuring hemoglobin levels was not necessary because patients were presenting in such conditions that it was more efficient to make a quick visual diagnosis, while in the Netherlands this was impossible because usually the degree of severity of illness was different. So the key characteristic of fluid space is that for a network thing, in a network, things that go together depend on one another, and if you take one away, the consequences are likely to be disastrous. But in the fluid, it isn't like that, and every individual element may be superfluous. In Harare, it may be useful to know people's hemoglobin levels, but in the Mozambique war zone, where iron and food are scarce, the absence of laboratory is scarcely noticeable at all, because even if the laboratory were to do what it was made for, what it produces would not. And my kind of point is that there is a shift. A shift happens from the network space to a fluid space, or rather more patches of fluidity are created within network space in case of the wartime zoos. And why is this happening? Why a shift is necessary in stressful in conditions where the network is disrupted? Because the thing is that, and this is what Action Network is all the time talking about, that rigid and structured systems are very fragile, and they can be very easily disrupted and destroyed. However, fluid systems are much and fluid networks, not networks, I will not mix up this, fluid structures are much more durable. And he talks about several kinds of durability that can be contribute to the maintenance of spaces. And this is material durability, which concerns whether something is literally durable or not. So food decays quickly, but the aquarium space is durable. So that
Okay, so we are sorry. We had some small, I don't know what happened, but we are back and yeah, everything can go.
okay, fine. The strategies that they can be borrowed from other networks, strategies of action. So it involves a deliberate planning. And then there's discursive durability, which is guaranteed by different kinds of discourses that mobilize actors to do what they're supposed to do. And then there is this durability of fluid space, which gives the actors here, human actors, I mean, the possibility to kind of rely more on themselves and act not according to the rules, but more according to the concrete situations that demand immediate response. And I refurbished a bit or refurnish the definition of a fluid space. The definition is kind of that the flexibility of decision making and eagerness to circumvent unnecessary and costly steps and rules in order to achieve maximum efficiency in if there is a scarcity of resources in a concrete empirical context is characteristic of a fluid space. And this involves negotiation aimed at the distribution and reprioritization of capacities and actions of various actions in order to maintain the life support network. And I'm done. Thank you. Yes, I will stop sharing or.
Yeah, you can stop sharing.
Okay.
And so now we open the floor to questions, which I'm sure there are plenty also from here. Yeah, sure you have questions. So one. Yeah, well, we are, as usual, going to monopolize the floor a little bit. So, Tyler.
Hello. Thanks for the presentation. So you're using Jakobonic school as well as Bruno Latour, and then this law, the last name was Law, and that's where fluid space comes from.
Yeah. So fluid space, it comes from John Lowen and Emily Moll. So these are also actor network theories, but they are like a little bit less famous than Latour.
Indeed. Okay. And then so the actor network space is transsubjective, as you called it. And this is what, I mean, I can definitely see what this brings to ecofield, I guess, or to Jakobonic school, that the Umwelt theory doesn't necessarily include the transsubjective space. Something like that.
Yeah.
And but does this transsubjective space, is it only navigated by the human observer, or is it also navigated by the non-human?
I think that this is kind of like I think, yes, in a way, it is something that is possible to account for by the researcher. So this is kind of my understanding, because actually this is a very nice question, because for me, sometimes the kind of the standpoints from which actor network theories are doing their accounts are a little bit confusing. Yes, in this case, I think that this is a kind of a space that is created by observing and making an account. So I don't think that it is possible to say that, for example, an animal has a network space or perceives a network space. So it's not. It's more of an analytical tool rather than what we would say that an animal has an invent. So a network space is just like a concept that enables to make sense of different sorts of actions.
Yeah. Good answer, safe answer.
Indeed, because I would also thought that there would be some sort of, I don't know, like phenomenological correlates or something, because you were talking about affordances also and these kind of things. But more importantly, we have Pauline. So please.
No, it's not for me, but yeah, we have a question here in Tartu.
Okay.
Come here. Yeah, okay. So I want to ask you, would you ever include the concept of magical umwelt in your thesis and this overall article? Because when you talked about all of this, I also could imagine in these times and communication of the concept of magical umwelt.
No, I am not including this. Because yeah, I remember I read about it some time ago, but I don't exactly remember what it is. And also generally, I would say that maybe it's a little bit of my frustration, but the extent to which the whole framework that I'm building is very, very pragmatic in a way. So maybe I would look into this magical umwelt and once again if it would make sense. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you. Okay. Do we have more questions from Tartu?
I don't think so. We are in small committee here.
Okay. What about the
questions?
I have something. I'm not even sure if this is a question entirely, but I was wondering, because a lot of what you talked about, the fluid space, reminded me of the subject of robustness, which is, I think, quite popular in the theory systems, especially when in relation to things like neural network. Basically, robustness referring to the subject of degradation with grace and the subject of being able to alter the individual elements of the system without affecting the function, the performance of the system. So I'm wondering if there is, if you considered looking into the subject of things like either simulated or real neural networks and the systems theory related to these things, which are related mainly to emergence, if it could be useful for your point of view.
Oh, no, I didn't, because I come from sociology, so I have no idea. But yes, it actually is very interesting. But could you please say the authors, maybe?
I don't have them in my mind. I can try to pick up, because I'm not an expert on this. I only came across this in works of like Folkolic, which I don't think is often translated into other languages. But definitely, if you look on robustness of a neural system, it should ping you something. I am just, this is why it's not really a question, but it's sort of just an idea that
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very interesting.
Okay. Any more questions?
Israel, may I
Yes,
formulate
of course.
simple methodological question? I would like to ask to Alex if it's about the scale of observation. If you are working on this, which scale is if the notion of Umwelt in this case of analysis is specific, is dependent of a specific or interspecific relation. If it's a good idea, for example, to observe what is happening in a different scale of observation, for example, applied to family or superfamilies of animals.
Yes, well, in case of observations, there are first of all certain empirical limitations of my analysis, which mainly pertains to the fact that I cannot go to Ukraine and observe it because they will not let me go back. So this means that mainly when this is possible to do, when there are videos, and there are some videos, but again, this yes, unfortunately I cannot do this observation of like groups of animals in the enclosures and so on. So it just
Yeah, sorry, I was also thinking, okay, so are there any more comments, questions? We have some time, so yeah. Yes.
I also have a question, but I got here late, so I have no idea if we already talked about it.
You can ask.
Just say that not be on camera.
Yeah.
So since I'm not quite sure if I'm understanding this correctly, since it's seem to imply, I'm sorry I got here late, so if I got something wrong, I apologize. But seem to imply that we're sort of disregarding the sort of point of view of the non-human animal in question when it comes to the discussing the food space. And I'm not quite even sure if this is a question or I'm just commenting, but I guess I wanted to ask if, like, would there be a difference in analyzing the space, considering like the, I don't know how to word this, like the input from the non-human animal that occupies the space, because I feel like there would be differences based on like the capabilities to communicate of different animals, because well, some animals are quite capable of communicating with human handlers, and then you could have stuff like, I don't know, amoebas or fish compared to something like, I don't know, that they don't know what's capable of communicating with humans quite independently. I guess, let's say dogs, we've studied dogs extensively. Does it even make sense what I'm getting at?
Well, I don't know when did you come, when did you arrive, but yes, it matters, of course. So because the ideas of the kind of the concept I talked about in the first part before I started talking about action network theory are exactly this account for the differences in possibilities of communicating as well, and the necessities to communicate. So for example, you don't really need to communicate much with crocodiles. So, but you need to communicate a lot with an elephant. So, and of course, the process of communication differs for each animal.
Thank you. Sorry for the weak question.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and I guess if there are no further questions, we can then thank Alex. Thank you very much. It was really great talk.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think we all, I think most of, at least for me, the takeaway is these fluid spaces, which is very cool notion. So yeah, so